Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and wow, do we have a packed episode for you today. Yesterday on Hacker News, we saw some fascinating discussions that really cut to the heart of what's happening in tech right now. We've got streaming services pushing users back to piracy. Yeah, that's happening again. We'll dive into why Steve Wozniak's philosophy on happiness versus achievement is resonating so deeply with developers. We're going to unpack the heated debate about whether AI can actually build software, check out Google's tiny new AI model that's got people, well, let's just say opinions are mixed. And we'll wrap up with a frustrating Mac gaming issue that's been driving developers crazy for over a year. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. You know what's wild? Disney Plus has lost $11.4 billion. Billion with a B, from 2019 to 2023. Paramount Plus and Max are each bleeding about $1 billion annually. These companies are hemorrhaging money while simultaneously making their services worse and driving customers away. It's like watching someone set their own house on fire while complaining about the cold. The Hacker News crowd is particularly fired up about the technical limitations too, like you can't watch 4K content on certain browsers because of DRM restrictions. You literally get better quality from a pirated file than from the service you're paying for. There's this whole thread about how streaming services artificially limit bit rates, compress audio to death, and then wonder why people with nice home theater setups are going back to downloading. And here's something interesting. One commenter, Saw6, actually defended iTunes movie rentals of all things, saying they offer great quality, special features, free 4K upgrades, basically suggesting that when you do digital distribution right, people will pay. But that's the exception that proves the rule, isn't it? The Pokemon example in the comments really drives this home. If you want to watch Pokemon, you need multiple services just to get different seasons. It's scattered everywhere. Meanwhile, on a piracy site, click, search Pokemon, boom, everything in one place, organized, ready to go. What's really striking me about this whole discussion is how we've gone backwards. Remember when Netflix first started streaming and it felt like the future? One service, tons of content, reasonable price. Piracy actually declined because Netflix was more convenient than torrenting. Now we've got, 15 different services? 20? Each one costs $15 to $20 a month. They're all losing content to each other. Shows disappear without warning. The community is basically saying the quiet part out loud here, that many of them have just given up and gone back to sailing the high seas, as they say, and they're not even apologetic about it. The sentiment is very much, we tried to do this the right way, the industry got greedy and made it worse than cable, so here we are. There's even this fascinating discussion about how Gabe Nealon from Valve called this years ago when he said piracy is fundamentally a service problem, not a pricing problem. Steam basically eliminated PC game piracy by making buying games more convenient than pirating them. But video streaming? They took the opposite approach, made everything less convenient, more expensive, more fragmented. You know what really gets me? The irony that we basically reinvented cable TV, but made it worse. At least with cable, you had one bill, one interface, and you knew where everything was. Now you're juggling a dozen apps, each with their own terrible UI, their own payment system, their own recommendations that don't talk to each other. The technical folks in the comments are also pointing out something crucial. This isn't even about the money for many of them. They're engineers, developers, tech workers. They can afford the subscriptions. But when you literally cannot get the quality you want legally, when you can't watch your purchased content offline on a plane, when a VPN blocks your access to content you paid for, at some point, you just throw your hands up and grab a torrent client. It's a massive failure of the industry, really. They had the solution right there with early Netflix, and they just threw it away for quarterly earnings reports and exclusive content wars that nobody asked for. Speaking of industry failures and what really matters in tech, our next story really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. It's about Steve Wozniak saying, "Life to me was never about accomplishment, but about happiness." And wow, with nearly 900 points and over 500 comments, this one clearly resonated with people. You know, in a tech world that's often obsessed with metrics, valuations, and crushing the competition, Woz's philosophy feels almost, I don't know, revolutionary, or maybe it's more like a return to what actually matters. The discussion thread is fascinating because it's filled with people who've actually met the guy, and they all tell basically the same story. He's exactly who he appears to be: genuine, curious, happy to chat with anyone about anything technical. One commenter shared this great story about meeting Woz at an event, and instead of the usual celebrity brush-off, Woz actually seemed genuinely interested in what they were working on. Another person mentioned seeing him at airports multiple times, just being a regular person, happy to talk tech with strangers. Can you imagine that happening with most tech CEOs today? What's really interesting is how the discussion naturally evolved into this comparison between Woz and Steve Jobs. And look, we all know that story. Jobs was the visionary marketer, Woz was the technical genius, but the commenters are pointing out something deeper here. They're saying the tech world desperately needs more Woz types, people who build things because they love building things, not because they want to dominate markets or become billionaires. There's this brilliant reference in the thread to a Kurt Vonnegut story about Joseph Heller. Vonnegut and Heller are at some billionaire's party, and Vonnegut says to Heller, "This guy made more money yesterday than your novel Catch-22 has earned in its entire history." And Heller responds, "Yes, but I have something he'll never have. Enough." That's Woz, right? He has enough. Multiple commenters pointed out that he's worth something like $100 million, which, sure, it's not Elon Musk money, but it's definitely never worry about anything ever again money. Now, there was some pushback in the thread, which I think is worth mentioning. One commenter, who claimed to work at Apple, said that internally, some people view Woz as, well, they used the word insane, which seems harsh. Their complaint was that he's too open, too willing to share his honest thoughts about Apple publicly. And another person argued that without Jobs pushing him, Woz would have just been content tinkering with his HP calculator forever, never actually shipping products that changed the world. But here's the thing. Would that have been so bad? I mean, the whole point of Woz's philosophy is that happiness matters more than world-changing accomplishments. The discussion really gets at this fundamental question in tech. Do we build things to make ourselves happy, or do we build things to make an impact? And can't it be both? What I love about this discussion is that it's not just hero worship. People are genuinely grappling with what success means in an industry that often defines it very narrowly. One commenter made this point that really stuck with me. They said something like, "We celebrate the Jobs types who change the world, but maybe we should celebrate the Woz types who show us it's okay to just be happy with what you're doing." The thread also touches on this idea of technical passion versus business ambition. Woz represents this pure love of the craft. He wanted to make computers because computers are cool, not because he wanted to build an empire. And in today's startup culture where everyone's trying to be the next unicorn, that perspective feels both refreshing and almost alien. You know what really comes through in these comments? A kind of wistfulness. Like people are looking at Woz and thinking, that could have been me if I hadn't gotten caught up in the rat race. There's this sense that somewhere along the way, the tech industry lost something important, that joy of creation for its own sake that Woz embodies. It makes you wonder if the next big innovation might come not from someone trying to build a billion-dollar company, but from someone in their garage just having fun with technology. Because that's essentially what Woz was doing when he created the Apple I, right? He wasn't trying to change the world, he was just trying to impress his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. And speaking of building things and what computers can and can't do, let's dive into a story that's really stirring up the developer community. Why LLMs can't really build software. This one pulled in almost 800 points and nearly 500 comments on Hacker News, and honestly, after reading through the discussion, I can see why it's hitting such a nerve. So, the author makes this pretty bold claim that while LLMs are great at cranking out code, and let's be real, they absolutely are, they're fundamentally missing something crucial that actual software engineers have. And it's not about syntax or knowing programming languages. It's about mental models. Here's the thing. When you or I build software, we're constantly running this loop in our heads, right? We build a mental model of what the requirements are, we write some code, then we build another mental model of what that code actually does, and when those models don't match up, that's where the real engineering happens. We figure out why they're different, and we iterate. The author's arguing that LLMs just can't do this. They can write the code, sure, they can even write tests and add logging statements, but they don't have that coherent mental picture of what they're building. And this shows up in really interesting ways. Like when an LLM hits a test failure, it doesn't know whether to fix the code or fix the test. It's essentially guessing. A human developer with a clear mental model would know, oh, the test is checking for the right behavior, my implementation is wrong, or vice versa. But the LLM, it's just pattern matching its way through, hoping something sticks. Now, the Hacker News crowd, they're having a field day with this one. The discussion is fascinating because you've got this real divide between people who are like, yeah, this is exactly my experience. LLMs are terrible at maintaining context. And others who are pushing back hard.
There's this commentator, Andrew Mutz, who basically says the article is completely wrong. They're using Klein with Anthropic's Sonnet model and claim it's doing test-driven development just fine, reasoning about failures, working like a junior engineer would. And that's actually a common thread in the discussion, this comparison to junior developers. Multiple people are saying, look, LLMs are basically like having a really eager junior dev who can code fast, but needs constant supervision and clear, narrow tasks. One perspective I found really compelling came from Jim DeBell, who argues we're approaching this whole thing wrong. They're saying, imagine if you took a human developer and just threw requirements at them and said, code this immediately, without a design phase, without iterative feedback, without proper processes. They'd fail too. Maybe the problem isn't that LLMs can't build software, but that we're not giving them the scaffolding and processes that human teams use. And then there's this whole other dimension about how we're using these tools. A bunch of developers are saying, forget the chat interface, just integrate this stuff directly into our IDEs. Make it part of the workflow, not this separate conversation we're having on the side. They want AI that can refactor code, generate boilerplate, handle the mechanical stuff, while they focus on architecture and design. What really strikes me about this whole debate is that it's forcing us to think about what software engineering actually is. Is it writing code? Is it problem solving? Is it maintaining these mental models? Because depending on how you answer that, you get very different conclusions about whether LLMs can really build software. The timing of this article is interesting too. We're at this moment where everyone's trying to figure out where AI coding assistants fit in the development process. Are they replacing developers? Are they just fancy autocomplete? Or are they something in between? Powerful tools that can handle certain aspects of development, but fundamentally can't do the full job. From reading through all these comments, it seems like the consensus, if there is one, is that LLMs are incredibly useful for certain tasks, but hit a wall when it comes to the bigger picture stuff. They can write a function. They can even write a pretty good function. But ask them to architect a system or debug something complex where they need to understand how multiple pieces interact, that's where things fall apart.
And you know what? Maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need LLMs to be complete software engineers. Maybe having them as these super-powered coding assistants that handle the tedious stuff while humans maintain the mental models and make the architectural decisions, maybe that's actually the sweet spot. But clearly, based on the heat of this discussion, we're nowhere near consensus on this yet. Now, let's talk about something that's got the Hacker News community pretty divided. Google's new Gemma 3 270M model, which they're calling a compact model for hyper-efficient AI. And when I say compact, I mean really compact. We're talking just 270 million parameters here. So here's what's fascinating about this release. Google is essentially betting that bigger isn't always better in the AI world.
They've designed this tiny model specifically for edge computing and mobile devices, and the architecture choices they've made are honestly kind of wild. Get this. Out of those 270 million parameters, 170 million are dedicated just to the embedding layer, leaving only 100 million for the actual transformer blocks. That's like building a car where 2/3 of your budget goes to the tires. It's completely backwards from how most models are designed. But Google seems to think that having this massive 256,000 token vocabulary is the secret sauce for handling specialized tasks across different domains and languages. The pitch from Google is pretty compelling on paper. They're saying this model achieves state-of-the-art instruction-following performance for its size class on something called the IF-eval benchmark. Basically, they're claiming that this tiny model can handle complex instructions that you'd normally need a much bigger model for. And the energy efficiency angle is huge. If this actually works as advertised, we could be looking at sophisticated AI running on your phone without draining your battery in 5 minutes. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean controversial. The Hacker News discussion around this has been brutal. Multiple users are reporting that the out-of-the-box performance is, and I'm quoting here, absolutely terrible. People are saying it hallucinates constantly, gives nonsensical answers to basic questions, and generally performs way worse than you would expect, even for such a small model. One commenter put it pretty bluntly. They asked why anyone would use this when Quen's 0.6 billion parameter model, which is roughly the same size category, apparently runs circles around Gemma 270M. And that's not just one person's opinion. There seems to be a consensus forming that if you want a small model that actually works, you're better off looking elsewhere.
Now, to be fair, there's another camp in this discussion that's pretty excited about the fine-tuning potential. Several developers are saying, look, forget about using it as a general-purpose model. That's not the point. They're seeing this as a blank canvas for specialized tasks. Want a model that can classify customer support tickets? Fine-tune this. Need something for named entity recognition in medical documents? This could be your starting point. The idea is that you take this efficient little foundation and mold it into exactly what you need for your specific use case. But even that optimistic view comes with skepticism. Some users are asking the million-dollar question. Has anyone actually deployed these tiny fine-tuned models in production? Because it's one thing to get excited about the potential, but if nobody's actually using them in the real world, well, that tells you something, doesn't it? What I find most intriguing about this whole situation is what it represents for the AI industry. Google, one of the biggest players in the game, is pushing hard into this ultra-small model space. They're basically saying, hey, not every problem needs GPT-4. And philosophically, I think they're right. We probably don't need a trillion-parameter model to sort emails or tag photos. But the execution here seems to be falling short of the vision. The unusual architecture with that massive vocabulary, it's a bold experiment, but based on the community feedback, it might be a failed one. Or maybe we're just not understanding how to use it properly yet. Sometimes these things take time for developers to figure out the right approach. The timing of this release is also interesting because we're seeing this broader trend of companies trying to democratize AI by making it run on everyday devices. Apple's doing it, Microsoft's doing it, and now Google's throwing their hat in the ring with Gemma 270M. The promise of AI that doesn't need cloud connectivity, doesn't invade your privacy, and doesn't cost a fortune to run, that's powerful stuff. But promises and reality are two different things. And right now, the reality seems to be that if you download Gemma 270M expecting it to be a mini ChatGPT, you're going to be disappointed. Very disappointed, according to the Hacker News crowd. The question is whether Google can iterate on this and prove the skeptics wrong, or if this is going to be remembered as an interesting experiment that didn't quite pan out. Story 5. Blurry rendering of games on Mac. All right, let's wrap up with something that's driving Mac developers absolutely crazy. Blurry rendering of games on Mac.
This one's got over 440 points and nearly 300 comments. And folks, sometimes the most frustrating bugs are the ones that seem like they should be simple to fix. But here we are, over a year later, and Mac gamers are still dealing with fuzzy, compressed visuals on their expensive MacBooks. So here's what's happening. If you've got one of those newer MacBooks with the notch, that little camera cutout at the top of the screen, your games are probably looking, well, kind of terrible. And it's not because the hardware can't handle it. It's because of a fundamental mismatch between what games think they're rendering and where they can actually draw on the screen. Let me break this down because it's actually pretty fascinating from a technical perspective. When Apple introduced the notch, they created this whole complex system of display regions. You've got your full display bounds, which includes that notch area up top. Then there's the safe area, which is everything below the notch. And finally, there's the full screen app area, which sits below the menu bar. 3 different regions. Now compare that to iOS, where they just have a simple safe area concept, and you start to see where things went sideways. The killer issue here is that Apple's own API, specifically CG Display Copy All Display Modes, is lying to developers. It's returning resolution information for the entire display, including that notch area where you can't actually draw anything. So, games dutifully render their frames sized for the full screen, but then the system has to squish them down to fit in the actual drawable area. Result? Everything looks compressed and blurry, like you're viewing your game through a foggy window. What really gets me about this, and apparently gets a lot of folks in the comments too, is that this bug report has been sitting with Apple since September 2023. We're talking FB13375033 if anyone wants to look it up. Over a year. No fix, no workaround from Apple, nothing. And this affects every single game on every single MacBook with a notch. The community discussion around this is where things get really interesting, though. You've got developers in there sharing their war stories and workarounds. Some are manually calculating safe areas, others are building custom resolution handlers, basically doing Apple's job for them. But then you've got this whole other conversation bubbling up about whether Apple even cares about gaming on Mac at all.
One commenter made a pretty compelling point. They suggested Apple might actually be financially motivated to keep Mac gaming mediocre. Think about it. If Mac gaming was great, developers might sell directly to users instead of going through the iOS App Store, where Apple takes that sweet 30% cut. It's a bit conspiracy theory-ish, but when you see fundamental issues like this going unfixed for over a year, you start to wonder. Now, to be fair, there's another perspective here. Some developers pointed out this isn't uniquely an Apple problem. Remember the Xbox 360 days? Similar issues with overscan on TVs where the render resolution didn't match the screen resolution. It's apparently a common challenge across the industry. The difference is, well, most companies actually fix these issues, especially when they're affecting every single game on their platform. And here's something that made me chuckle. Buried in the comments, there were actually a few people saying they deliberately bought Macs because they're bad at gaming. They wanted to avoid the distraction while studying or working. I mean, that's one way to look at the silver lining, I guess. But seriously, this whole situation highlights something bigger about Apple's approach to Mac gaming. Between the notches, the rounded corners that also cause rendering issues, and these unfixed API issues, it feels like gaming is an afterthought in their hardware design process. They're creating these beautiful, distinctive displays, but then leaving developers to figure out how to actually make software work properly on them. The technical debt here is real, and it's accumulating. Every new hardware quirk, every unfixed API issue, it all adds up to make Mac development that much more painful. And when you're already fighting an uphill battle to bring games to a platform with a smaller gaming audience, these kinds of fundamental rendering problems might just be the thing that makes developers throw up their hands and say, forget it. And that wraps up yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a day, right? We've seen how the streaming industry learned all the wrong lessons from cable TV and is driving users back to piracy. We've reflected on Steve Wozniak's philosophy about happiness over achievement, something that feels increasingly countercultural in today's hustle-obsessed tech world.
We've wrestled with the fundamental question of whether AI can truly build software, or if it's just really good at pattern matching. We looked at Google's ambitious but apparently flawed attempt to squeeze AI into 270 million parameters. And we ended with Apple's year-long indifference to a basic rendering bug that's making games look terrible on their premium hardware.
You know, looking across all these stories, there's a common thread here: the tension between what technology promises and what it actually delivers. Whether it's streaming services fragmenting into oblivion, AI models that can't quite think, or hardware companies prioritizing aesthetics over functionality, we're seeing the gap between Silicon Valley's vision and the messy reality of implementation. But that's what makes following Hacker News so fascinating, isn't it? It's where the people actually building and using this stuff come together to call out the BS, share workarounds, and occasionally, just occasionally, find those moments of genuine innovation that make it all worthwhile. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into yesterday's top Hacker News stories. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's roundup. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, take a page from Woz's book and remember that happiness matters more than metrics. This has been Hacker News Daily. I'll catch you tomorrow with the next batch of stories that get the tech world talking. Stay curious, everyone.